Hey guys, so today on my stream I decided to do something a little bit different and spent almost the entire stream just talking about sort of like game design and how we should be thinking about, Runeterra's position in it. Stuff like, why or, what exactly are the problems with this meta? What exactly are the problems with some of the things people complain about, like elusives and Heimer, and what kind of like, most importantly, what the best solutions to these kinds of things are. It ended up being like incredibly long. I covered a ton of topics in these 5 hours in regards to game design. I can't help it. If you've watched this channel for a while, you know that this happens every once in a while. Because game design is a really big passion of mine. But I think that, a lot of people were actually, a surprising amount of people on my Twitch stream were very interested in the discussion. And I think you guys will be too, because there's really a lot to break down here. And a lot that you will learn. There will be a lot that will definitely surprise you. It's just the design of making removal really expensive and letting units attack the turn they are summoned. It means that unit combat is strongest way to beat a board, but elusives bypass that. Yeah, I think that's potentially a good way of putting it. There's definitely a good point in here. I think I actually disagree with this though. I think that the reason that removal is expensive is because of the idea of open attack versus develop, and having like basically a safety that you can play on either is something that you will have to pay a price for, right? Because so in Runeterra there's this idea of forking, right? There's this very fundamental notion. There's this very, very, very fundamental notion of, this is a completely different category. Okay, so it is open attack versus develop. And because of this, we actually have a pretty interesting concept in deck building and play pattern. A concept that exists in, I think, no other card game, which is the idea of forking. So forking, term from chess. I suck at chess. It's just like the easiest term that people understand, which is basically trapping the opponent between two bad positions. So a control deck will be running Ruination to punish develop, as well as a ton of fast things to punish. So it's like Grasp, Whale, Vengeance, and even stuff like Vile Feast in a lot of situations is totally fine, like to punish open attack. Now, I think like intuitively, a lot of people understand that the slow things punish development, but I've actually seen a lot of people sort of like not really think about this second part the way they should be, which is that, yeah, fast speed stuff punishes open attack just as much as slow speed stuff punishes development. Because when I open attack and I'm foregoing my ability to put my mana into this combat, and you put your mana into this combat, well, I get an incredible disadvantage in that exchange. And that's why spells are expensive in Runeterra. It's because like Grasp might cost 5 mana. In Runeterra, by the way, when you compare this to Magic, in Magic, this costs 3 mana. Plus 2 mana. Plus 2 mana. Huge. Huge. Okay? What does this mean? Well, it's actually good enough. Because open attacking is so fundamentally valuable outside of fast options. When you open attack in late positions, your opponent's going to be on like 9 mana. If I open attack with fast speed options, I'm potentially denying the opponent, yeah, like 9 mana, 10 mana, which is huge. So yeah, I mean, you are paying 2 extra mana every time for a card like Grasp. Cards like, well, literally every fast speed thing in Runeterra is overcosted. And we haven't gotten into like spell mana yet either, really, by the way. If I open attack with fast speed options, I'm potentially denying the opponent 9 or 10. This is really big. So these spells end up being quite a bit stronger than their Magic counterparts. This is a pretty good time to talk about Will. If you come from other card games, you'll look at Will of Ionia and be like, hey, but Will is, Will at 4 mana, that's probably not OP. But by the same logic, you're also coming into Runeterra and you're thinking cards like Vengeance and Grasp are like the worst things ever and completely unplayable. And they're not. And I thought that too, and I was completely wrong. I looked at Vengeance and I was like, this is the worst. And everyone I know coming from other card games did this too. Like, immediately, at the start. Some learned faster than others. I was a slow learner in this regard. You know, it took me literally like 2 months to accept that Vengeance was a competitive level card. Okay, I'm exaggerating. It took me like a month and a half. But that's really slow. That's really slow. And at that point that you're realizing that these cards are all perfectly competitive, the idea of Will being 3 mana less than Vengeance is pretty ridiculous. And I think in like a fairly objective sense, Will is the biggest limiter to the metagame. We can see very strong evidence of this in tournament metas, where for literally the past actual 6 months since tournaments have been going on, okay, 5 months, the meta has almost always been, not without exception, but almost always been, ban Ionia and bring a lineup that you normally can't run on ladder. And because of this, because this has persisted across balance patches, across metas, across the deny nerf, the meta for tournaments has mostly been ban Ionia and bring decks you couldn't normally really run on ladder. That is extremely strong evidence in it, but for that reason, the tournament diversity is larger than the ladder diversity, at the very least in like a high level sense. Obviously, when you look at the full ladder, tournament diversity is lower because tournament players are, you know, they're tryharding and they're good players, so they're going to narrow the range of decks they're going to build. Whereas in ladder, there's a bunch of shit decks from players that really just don't care. And so, of course, when you look at the full ladder, the diversity is going to be higher. But if we're looking at like the competitive ladder, when we're comparing it to the tournament competitive ladder, then suddenly we have incredibly strong evidence that if Will was at something like, let's say, 5 mana even, which I think would be fine. I don't think there's any extreme change necessary. It's just ridiculous that it costs 4. I think this is a very, very easy change. Like, we basically know that it has to lead to an environment that has more diversity than less diversity. Will still be played in decks. This is a good card. It counters a lot of things. It probably won't be an auto 3 of anymore. It's not going to be bad. There are a lot of people that think that the only people that don't agree with this change suggestion, they have 2 arguments. They say it keeps things in check, and they say it is going to be bad if it's 5 mana. The second argument is just like, I mean, if you think Will would be bad at 5 mana, you don't know how good it is at 4. It's insane at 4. Like really, really, really insane. Don't get me wrong. I don't expect it to be an auto 3 of. But, I mean, it'll basically be a fair comparison to Vengeance at that point. If I'm ass pulling a random number here, I found that in pretty close to 2/3 of scenarios, completely doesn't matter. In about, anecdotally, don't read into this number, this is just like my personal experience. It's probably not going to be hyper accurate, but honestly, it doesn't need to be. Anywhere between 50 and 75% is an unacceptable range, and this, I think, would be falling within that. The fact of the matter is that, like, the opponent getting the card back in their hands doesn't really end up affecting most situations in the game. It does affect some, for sure. It's not, you know, but there's also plenty of situations where Vengeance is notably worse than Will. That actually happens quite a bit, like more often than you'd think. That killing a card is worse than putting it in your hand. Maybe you don't want to like trigger certain effects. Very, very often. There's a lot of cards that are like sort of like death immune. We don't really see them in the current meta, like Tryndamere. We've seen them a lot more in the past, and we'll eventually see them in the future. That kind of thing. Too expensive versus aggro. Yeah, of course. So yeah, Will to 5 is, I think, kind of like the easiest change. I think there's no way this isn't a good change. And I actually have perfect faith in the devs that they will make Will 5 mana. I just don't know if it'll be as soon as this upcoming patch. I hope so. That'd be nice. Now, let's actually talk a little bit more about this sort of open attacking concept. In card games, nobody knows what the hell they're doing. It's kind of like the blind leading the blind. So let's explain exactly what I mean by this. Because I'm not saying the devs are stupid. I'm saying they don't know what they're doing. Okay, no. Let me actually explain this. So the thing with card games, it's a pretty novel concept, right? Card games are very deep, deceptively deep. deceptively deep. And people, so every new card game that comes out adds a spin on the genre, sometimes major. Most card games are sticking with the tried and true formula set by Magic and then established further by Hearthstone. And every game that has come out since then that we're talking about, there's a few that have broken the formula that we would still call card games. I would call Auto Chess as a card game, but that's a story for another time. Everything that comes out massively is just a spin on that formula. And the thing is, and again, this is not an insult to the devs, I would be in the same position if I was developing a card game. The thing is, nobody really understands the full implication of their own spin. And that's because it's really fucking hard. That's it. So, what does that mean? Well, let's give examples of that. It takes devs a while to figure it out. Usually they do figure it out. Hearthstone, they actually changed a lot. We kind of forget that because it's been years and years, but Hearthstone changed a lot back in the day from the Magic formula. And it took Blizzard probably about 2-3 years to sort of figure out how the fundamentals and the different sort of let's say demographic, how the fundamentals and the different demographic are going to change how they should be thinking about their game in comparison to Magic. Hearthstone was a ripoff of another game, so they had an easier time to understand the spin. Yeah. I forget what other game it was, but I knew this. Yeah. But basically, this is really hard to do. What does it mean for Runeterra? WoW TCG? In terms of what this means, let's talk about... God, can I give good examples? Because the minor changes that people make to the Magic the Gathering / Hearthstone formula end up having really major implications in design. Really, really major implications in design. And Runeterra is a game that falls victim to this. The Runeterra devs, I don't think, fully understand the implication of their own spin. Again, that's not a bash on them. Literally, this is basically impossible to do. I wouldn't be able to do this right away. It would take a lot of time to do this. Although Runeterra has been in development for 8 years, so they did. Whatever. Okay. Anyway, Runeterra has a couple of spins. It spins the alternating system, great. The spell mana, great. By the way, both of these are great fucking spins. I love these takes on a card game. These are amazing. They do so many good things to the concept, right? These are kind of the big two ones, right? Is there even a third one? That's kind of the alternating system sort of embodies it. Inbuilt haste. Yeah. Inbuilt haste. Yeah. Absolutely. Haste. And regions. Okay. We'll call these 4. I think that's fine. So haste means you get to attack on the same turn you get played. Now, depending on what you're comparing it to, haste might or might not be a spin. But in this case, we're comparing it to Magic and a lot of those similar games, even Hearthstone has Summoning Sickness. The fact that every unit gets to attack the turn it's played is something that was endemic to Yu-Gi-Oh! Which I actually played a lot of. I'm a Yu-Gi-Oh! Boy. But it's very unusual for a lot of these other games. Everything comes from Magic. You know why? There's a simple answer to that. It's basically because most of the devs come from Magic. Magic is kind of the forefather. It's Magic is what everyone's basing their models on, basing their perceptions on. It's just the best thing to compare. It's not necessarily just because it was the first in the market at all, per se, but it's just that is how the game is being developed as a comparison to Magic. So some people might point out that Challenger doesn't counter Vigilance. Challenger doesn't counter elusives as well as maybe intended because of haste. That's a potential. This isn't the main argument of mine. Honestly, I don't know if this is that strong of an argument, but that's a kind of example of where we might see sort of devs not understanding their own spin to the genre, right? It's elusives is stronger than intended due to vigilance. This is really, really big. So haste means being able to attack the turn you get played. Vigilance means being able to block the same turn you attack. which in Magic you cannot do. In Magic, when you attack, you can't block the next turn. That's really, really huge. So what that means is not only affecting elusives, but fearsome, which it hasn't been a problem for a while, but old school players will know that fearsome was like the first big cancer, basically, that lasted for, you know, a good bit of time. I've heard people say elusives are strong because there's no reach. This is one of the most ridiculous things I've heard. Reach isn't a balancing factor. Again, I think reach could be an interesting idea for the game. I don't think it would necessarily be bad, but it wouldn't fix problems per se. Reach isn't a balancing factor in Magic, like, almost at all. It's like some competitive cards happen to have reach, and, you know, in draft, in some draft formats, depending on the set, it can be more valued than others. You know, it's not necessarily like a non-factor, but it's not a balancing point. It's mostly just like, it never really like affects high tier metas in a big way. Reach in draft is actually important. Yeah. It's a lot bigger in draft. For sure. But it's definitely not the same comparison to elusives. So the real reason is because of vigilance. And this is a very, very, very simple thing. Vigilance means because attacks don't have to not block next turn, because of this, the ability to block is much higher value, thus disabling that is much higher value. And with disabling that, this is where we enter elusives and fearsomes, right? This was kind of the first big problem that Runeterra faced. The first big one. And we saw this for the first like 3 months of Runeterra, that were, when it wasn't dominated by fearsome, it was dominated by elusives, right? This is probably the single biggest historical example we have of sort of this phenomenon that I'm talking about. I'm going to take this in a couple of other directions, but the idea of the sort of like comparison failing, and this, the ability to disable blocks and get around blockers is on a really, really high value. There's so many games that elusives win. Raise your hand if you can imagine a game like this. I have an elusive board, and I don't have lethal, but I can make you at low health. So I make you at low health, and then you'll attack me next turn, and I'll use my cards to block, because, I mean, they just attacked, but I can still block. And then your board does no damage. Maybe I lose my entire board. It doesn't even matter to me. And then I'll play like 1 or 2 more elusives next turn and win. I can kill off my entire board, and it doesn't matter. The importance of being able for the elusive players to block and just not care is insanely powerful. Like, when you can compare it to Magic. Like, the fact of the matter is that, you know, this could potentially be a solution for elusives. There are several. I don't know what would be best. I don't claim to know the best solution for elusives. Honestly, I haven't thought a ton about each individual solution, but let's break them down. Some people say elusive keyword is lost the first time damage is dealt. That's a potential suggestion. Could make sense, who knows? Another one is elusive keyword is lost after the turn on every unit. Basically, every unit uses elusive, like Blade Scout. You'll note that this is sort of interesting. It fits the fundamental of the game in the same way that Ephemeral and Barrier do. That's kind of interesting. So, like Ephemeral, Barrier. And I'll take this moment to point out that Ephemerals and Barriers are a really, really, really good example of the devs understanding their spin very well. Like, when I looked at Barrier the first time, I was like, this is kind of weird. It's like Divine Shield, but it goes away after 1 turn. But because of the alternating attack system, Ephemerals becomes a really interesting concept. Like, the idea of a temporary per turn effect has that nature of duality. It's a different concept depending on whether you play it on attack and defense. And the same is true with Barrier. And that's very interesting. So these are great examples of the game design, the card design respecting the fundamentals that they've set up. I think that's great. Anyway, the third suggestion, and this is kind of interesting, would pay respect to this all. And you guys might know where I'm going with this, which is elusives only. This wouldn't affect every unit, but elusives can't block after they attack. Who knows? Maybe that's a decent idea. I'm not necessarily saying a keyword tweak even has to occur. I think long term it would be best that some tweak fundamentally happens to the keyword. I don't know if that would be... As a dev, I probably wouldn't do that yet. I might explore other options. Actually, as a dev, I probably would have done that already. But as I would be fine exploring other options. And, you know, I mean, the first steps aren't even necessarily related to the elusive cards themselves. I don't think they're in a state that is always going to be a problem. Let's get back to the main point. Now that we're done with examples, now that we're done on our branching paths, what else do we have? Well, we've got the alternating system, we've got the spell mana. They understand this pretty well with... But also, I'd like to point out, alternating system leads to the concept of open attacking. The regions, I don't have much to comment about this. I have to list it as one of the big spins, but I have really nothing to say about this. But the one big thing is that there is this major dichotomy. Open attack punishers we can think of in a lot of ways. Let's give great examples of this. Ruination is a big one. Avalanche is a big one. But these don't have to be big. They can be pretty small. Iceveil Archer is usually a big open attack punisher, right? Wait. Hang on. Wait. I put this in the wrong category. Wait. You guys are right. I listed it backwards. Okay. Development punishers. You know, we fixed it. Okay, the development punisher, Iceveil Archer. Because if you play a unit and I play an archer, that's a really big punish. Whereas because it's a blocker's advantage game, Iceveil Archer is really a defensive card. Like, you can play it on offense, but because it's blocker's advantage, it won't do as much. So it's a great development punisher. Then we've even got stuff like Yone, totally fine, and a lot of the Yasuo deck. And then we've got the open attack punishers. This is going to be basically everything at fast speed. And these are going to be your wills. These are going to be your grasps, your vile feast, your vengeance. Even if it's cheap, don't discount things just because they're cheap, right? Even if they're cheap, they're still potentially pretty big punishers, right? In the same way that like Iceveil Archer can punish, like Vile Feast can absolutely punish some open attack. Even burst. Yeah, fast. I guess I should say fast/burst, but yeah, fast or above. Okay. Let me expand this outward a little bit more because I'm running more and more. Okay. And then we've got a sort of third category, which is both. And the best example is Concussive Palm, which can function as both. Concussive Palm, if you use it at fast speed, does give you a stun. And if they develop into it, it gives you a stun and a blocker, which is interesting. And you can also point that Vile Feast can sometimes be both. That's a little... It usually doesn't happen, but I'll list this just for the sake of kind of like, you know, comparison. Now, I see a bit of a lack. I would say I see a bit of a lack of the card design really respecting this fundamental. And this is huge because I think this might be the single biggest reason that Shadow Isles is the only control deck. For basically the history of Runeterra, Shadow Isles has been the only control deck. A lot of decks you probably think are control are probably closer to combo. What is my point? My point is that there's a lot of archetypes that don't make as much sense because they don't have access to both of these concepts. And they're missing maybe only one or the other, right? This is very, very, very important. We have this idea of card games of the aggressor, who's the beatdown. There's going to be a slower player, And mostly it's the slower player that wants to fork the opponent into a bad situation. Forking just means, you know, I'm against an Ashe deck. I want to develop, but then they could play an Archer. I want to open attack, but then they play Harsh Winds, and I haven't spent my mana on a developer, so the Harsh Winds would really wreck me. That's forking, right? Having both options, right? You can find examples in every region, but some regions just do it better. Exactly. That's exactly right. Yes, that's a good point. I shouldn't say no region has it. It's like, yeah, we could fork instead of Ruination, maybe Yone, you know? I mean, Yone's kind of not bad, but it doesn't have enough of that level of punish, really. Iona is the ultimate open attack punisher region by a lot. Yes. Shadow Isles, everything except for Ruination does a lot on that too. Whereas PNZ actually sort of, oddly enough, lacks both, which is kind of weird. It's kind of, yeah, very, very strange. Technically, Mina is an Ionia Ruination. Mina costs 9 mana, and Ruination costs like 3 to 2 less mana. I mean, it's not about the amount of mana, right? It's about the turn. Like, turn 9 is, the game's over. The game's always over on turn 9. So, it does feel like, given this fundamental of Legends of Runeterra, this dichotomy of open attack versus development, I would like to see, and I've never heard anyone talk about this, I would like to see a card design that better respected this. What that would mean is more available options between these open attack and sort of like open development punishes. Do you guys know why that in every meta we've ever seen, and every meta we're going to see until something changes, either Shadow Isles or Ionia will be tier 1? There's more than one reason. Honestly, this might not even be the biggest reason, but these are kind of like the only 2 regions that have like powerful open attack punishers. Harsh Winds is okay. In the past, it's been somewhat better. At some point, does it become a coin flip of develop versus open attack if you have too many things that respond to both? Yes, absolutely. It absolutely might not necessarily be great. At the same time, I don't know if I'd say coin flip per se, because there's a lot of situations that will boil down to go fish, and there's a lot of game design a big game design shortcoming. What do you call it? Not a trap hole, a hole, a pitfall. Yeah, pitfall. A big game design pitfall is where a lot of things could end up being good ideas, but end up to these go fish scenarios. You don't want your game turning into go fish. However, I do think that the open attack versus development, you know, you don't always want to have every game doing it, but it's not go fish. A big difference is that you as the player have the option, and you as the player will be always on some amount of hand read. Now, this might not affect like every player, but I think for the most part, not most players are even really thinking too much about open attacking versus developing, right? And that's a big difference between like those go fish nightmares, which is that like at the very least, this is more of a hand read. But I'm not disagreeing at all. You don't necessarily want this in too much of an amount, right? Everything with a balance. But it does feel like certain regions just lack options that really limit their ability to play in certain ways too much. Again, you don't want every region to be able to do everything, for sure. But here's a problem. There's a lot of cards that only make sense if a region can actually be really okay at doing something. And that you don't necessarily have the luxury of being able to go into a very specific second region just for those tools. So, a good example of that, I would say, the Nox Control Archetype that is mostly centered around the idea. There's a lot of these cards. There's a lot of like the sort of like Nox cards that you can tell are trying to be control cards. And the big thing is they don't tend to have great open attack punishes. And part of what that means is, this is by the way why that some of them have even had to run as bad cards as Culling Strike, and in certain metas that might have even been correct. But they're just fundamentally missing cards like Will, Vengeance, grasp, whale, like any sort of like high impact, fast speed, open attack thing. Now, a couple of points I'll add to this that are really important. Some of their reactive cards, Noxian Guillotine and Ravenous Flock, both exist in a state of potentially being able to punish those open attacks, but they're too cheap. You want a medium-sized thing to be great there, right? They're too cheap. But more importantly, they require a preset board state. If the opponent open attacks, I can't use Blade's Edge into Guillotine. I can't do that because I only have one action. So I can't set up a Guillotine unless it was already set up. And the same is true for something like Ravenous Flock. And that, I think, is a flaw. Now, you might say a lot of things to this. You might say, well, but swim, just run, that should be what your second color does. Or you might say, well, but swim, it's kind of like okay for that to be a bit of a weakness with it. So the reason why I don't think that's true, and this is kind of like the end all, is A, there's a good amount of the card pool that's dedicated for this slow play Nox archetype. Depending on like how we're defining Nox control, we could even include cards like Trifarian Assessor and City Breaker into that. These don't have to be like pure control spells. And B, the biggest thing is like control Nox isn't really very good. Stuff like Reckoning, for example, could be a control Nox card. We only really see this in mid-range decks. Control Nox isn't very good. And I would say that's the single biggest flaw of it. And it's not enough of a solution to say, oh, just go into Ionia and run Will. Even if that worked on a balance perspective, you don't want archetypes to be in that position of, I have to run this second region because I'm flawed in this one way. And so, yes, you don't want every region to have access to everything. And yes, identity is important. And yes, there's certain things that should be balanced around having to go into a second region. But despite all of those things, it would probably be, in my opinion, healthier for the meta if something that with such a dedicated amount of cards had some decent option in that way. I do feel like there are too many fast punishers, they're really all just in Ionia and Shadow Isles. Like, really outside of those, except for Harsh Winds, which can only be run in a very specific archetype in Freljord, really, there's kind of nothing. And that's one card, right? And I think that that degree of limitation is bad. Again, everything needs to be balanced. Everything needs to be balanced. Limitation breeds creativity. And limitation is not bad. Limitation can be good to a degree. Freedom can be good to a degree. Game design is about balancing limitation with freedom. You don't want to give your players too much freedom. And by the way, one of the biases in player suggestions is always going to be on the axis of freedom. Always. Because players will intuitively want more freedom. You'll see this in the form of, for example, the Black Market Merchant card not being revealed, or being revealed. The player will always opt for control. But in reality, you don't want too much control. Because there will be a loss of diversity when that happens, right? And this is just kind of my overall point when I'm coming into this topic, right? Like, it's very important to understand, no developer understands their own game. There's always like, nobody really understands the full implication of their own spin. But, I actually think the Runeterra devs are pretty good about it. I mean, they got a lot of the like open attacking and spell mana things pretty early on. A lot of spells were really quote-unquote overcosted. The fact that Vengeance started at 7 is pretty impressive. I actually might have expected Vengeance to start at 6 and then get nerfed to 7. Yeah, that's pretty good. That was pretty heads up, sure. I like the fact that Ephemeral and Barrier exist in the way that they do, although of course the Ephemeral archetype is sort of too flawed and really limits that. Those are great systems, you know? Like, they do understand their spins in a lot of ways, but the biggest shortcoming in the past has been, you know, the Vigilance and Haste really messing up a lot of metas. Really badly. And then I would also say this is less big of a problem. I really do think this is a problem, and I really do think people should be talking about this. I think that if the card design was keeping this more in mind, and not just the card design, but the card balancing as well, I think we would have actually a pretty big improvement. Like, we would see a lot more diversity and a lot more tension-based play patterns, where you do have to be thinking more about the opponent, which again, to a degree, you don't want that too much. It's not like complexity is always good. Nothing is always good. Everything needs to be balanced. But at the current point in time, I just think that this is sort of being overlooked from the design standpoint. How do you fix it though? Just more sets? Well, what you could do is, let's go ahead and give an example. How would you fix it? So I'm going to ask for an example. We haven't talked a lot about these, but what it would be is relegating certain cards more towards those roles rather than the idea of sort of like generic value, right? Like, let's say, for example, I know Ionia is a touchy subject right now, so people, obviously we don't want Ionia buffed in the current meta, but don't worry about that. That shouldn't really be part of this argument. This is just an example. You could take a card like Yone. A card like Yone is sort of meant to be, a nice development punisher, of which Ionia is actually somewhat lacking. Palm might help that a bit. And you look at Yone, and he's juggling three things at once. He's juggling being a stun archetype card. He's juggling being an a development punisher. Did I say the wrong thing? He's juggling being a development punisher, and he's juggling being, honestly, like a decent value card. He's a 7/6/6. So what I would say is, a couple of things like this, maybe his stats should be lowered, and he should be better at doing the kind of like thing that he's meant to do in terms of punishing the open attack. In this case, I don't think you could make him stun 3 enemies or anything like that. That might be a little too carried away, potentially, with how Yasuo plays. I don't know. I think it might actually be fine like that, but that might be a little too strong with something like Ezreal. The point is that you would take specific cards, particularly the more expensive cards. Look at cards like 5 mana and up. The way to fix this, that's a bad example. Let's ignore that example. You look at cards that have like 5 mana up, and you look at ones that are sort of trying to be, development or open attack punisher cards, and you make them better at doing that thing and compensate them by being a role player, fulfilling that role, and, being basically less generally strong because of that, right? Because the unfortunate reality is, in Runeterra, expensive mana cards are even worse than expensive mana cards in other card games. One of the first things you learn in like Magic or Hearthstone is like, most expensive cards are on average bad. Because like games are kind of fast and you can't be too greedy. You're gonna get rushed down. There's a lot of expensive cards that are good, but when in doubt, you do. A big new player mistake is they'll load too many expensive cards in the deck. That's what I mean. So we have that bias in that way. In Runeterra, it's even worse. The reason for that is because of the alternating action system. You are, by playing something expensive, giving up reactivity on the next turn. And you might say Magic sort of has that, and it kind of does, but not quite to the degree, because it only affects certain decks in Magic, whereas it affects like every deck in Runeterra. Because if you play like a big expensive card and tap out of any option, then you're just giving up a lot of not just optionality, but threat as well. When the opponent sees you at 0 mana, they can do a lot more, right? And so let's just take a look here. Let's look at the list of 5 mana and up cards. Because you might think that the idea of an expensive card probably starts at like 7 mana. It does not, my friend. An expensive card starts at 5 mana in this video game. So let's look at these 5 mana and up cards and count like how many of them are viable. There's actually like 3 or 4 on the screen right now. Not too bad. Deep Meditation, I'm not really going to count that. Its whole gimmick is it's not 5 mana. Detain has seen some fringe play. It's not necessarily terrible. It's definitely like, not a terrible amount of these 5 mana cards being bad, a good chunk, but it's actually okay. We get to this area though. We get to this down here, and suddenly we're seeing like almost nothing but duds. Almost nothing but duds for a while. We get to the 6 mana, and I mean, you guys see where I'm going with this. Most of them just don't really make sense, and aren't even that close. Some of them are actually close to making sense, and that's fine. Like, I can look at Reckoner and I can be like, well, competitive decks aren't using him, but I wouldn't say that Reckoner is a flawed card. Like, this card's fine. In fact, if anything, it might be quite strong. Even at 6 mana, which is really expensive, like, I don't think it really has, in and of itself, a terrible problem. The meta's maybe a bit fast for it right now, and the bigger problem might lie with the general kind of, like, problems of the deck it's trying to fit into overall. Right, but yeah, just look at all these expensive cards and look at how bad they are. And like I said, every card game does have this problem, but I do think Runeterra has it even more than most. So what should that mean? What should that mean for the design? You know, maybe that is sort of a hidden fifth spin that I didn't talk about. And it's not minor either. It's not minor either, which is that expensive cards are just too weak. Well, what that could mean is I think it's not a good thing for the game that ramp is in a sorry state right now. And don't get me wrong, ramp in some other card games can be pretty toxic at times. It's a very delicate one. You need to make sure, like, you know, you need to make sure ramp is good. But I think what this could mean is that it would probably end up with, like, more across the board playability if more of the high mana things in the game were represented by spells as opposed to units. And this exists for two reasons. Because spell mana, and because the idea of tapping out under option. Not being able to tap out under options feeling really quite bad, and spells being sometimes inherently more active. That being said, I don't think that's a major factor. My suggestion is, like, at the end of the day, the psychology of, like, a big unit, a lot of players, particularly, like, weaker players, will like the psychology of, like, you know, a big dude, and spells might not really be able to offer that. I mean, War Mothers, I think, you know, could be more fine. I don't know. It's like, I do feel like if Runeterra was designed in a way to, you know, more so build around its own fundamentals, we might see a couple more of these kinds of War Mothers type cards and a couple less of these, you know, kind of like 8 and 9 mana cards, maybe. I don't know. I mean, it wouldn't necessarily, like, don't get me wrong, War Mothers isn't an example of where I would consider it, you know, a great positioned card. I just mean, like, a more expensive mana card that will still fulfill the sort of, like, Timmy nature. Timmy is basically just liking big impact, you know, things effectively, short version. And War Mothers is kind of like a War Mothers and Harrowing are spells that manage to do that, right? Whereas, like, if you have too many reactive spells, you might not really get that. And that's kind of the entire point of having high mana things that are on average not going to be super competitive. I don't know. That's a little food for thought. Honestly, that's a fairly minor point. I don't have too much to say about that. It's a lot less. It's way, way, way less important than, like, the sort of, like, forking health point I was mentioning before. And honestly, I haven't even thought about it too much. I don't really know, like, what direction I would take it in, but I thought it was kind of like a sort of interesting side thing to bring up. And I think that finishes up that comment. Okay, so now we have done a grand total of 4. We've done 4 comments on the Twitter. We've done 4 comments on the Twitter. How many comments were there on this? 80? Okay, so we've got 76 more. Okay. It's obviously not going to be that long. Speedrun? Yeah, we're speedrunning this. We're blowing through these.